I think, regrettably, John Henry, that most Catholics do not fully understand the history of Catholicism in China since Chairman Mao, since the Communist Revolution, and they don't understand how the church related to Rome and the stresses that have been in that relationship. And then, they hear about, oh, the Chinese were sold out, they hear these things reported or described, but they don't know what that means. So could you maybe just give them an abbreviated version and help them understand what was the status quo and how that's been ruptured?
Pope Benedict tried to work with principally Cardinal Joseph Zen, who was the Cardinal of Hong Kong, to work with the underground church in China, which was the only true and faithful church in China, because the patriotic Catholic Church is all about one thing, as Cardinal Zen will tell you, and anybody who's studied the issue for a long time will tell you, they're all about making the Chinese state the be-all and end-all. They want to be God. They want to do away with religion, as all communist regimes have. And this is the process by which they're going to get there. They knew they couldn't do it by repression because it's only showed the martyrs. The church flourishes in the time of martyrdom.
Right.
And so what they knew is they had to infiltrate, as you often mention, the church. And they have done so with this version of the church they call the patriotic church in China, which has always had government appointed bishops and clergy who were actually spies and so on for the Chinese government anyway. And so there was always this very healthy and growing underground church in China, which remained totally faithful to Rome. The popes worked with that through Cardinal Zen and others with the underground church. And so this was going on, going forward, always with repression. The government, when they found them, would arrest priests and persecute people. We know they've destroyed churches. They destroyed beautiful shrines that they had in China, Catholic shrines all over the place, and more and more repressive as they could be. Now, under Pope Francis, they have come up with this so-called Sino-Vatican Chinese Vatican Agreement, which basically makes the patriotic church the church in China,
Right.
encouraging all the underground Catholics to come into it, which basically feeds them to the lions.
Right.
And this is known by all the people who were working on this situation. And the most interesting case is that of Cardinal Parolin. So Cardinal
Right.
Parolin, who's the Secretary of State, was actually the head of negotiations with China under Pope Benedict. And Pope Benedict was very clear in his messaging. Everybody understood the program, what was going on in China. And yet now, under Pope Francis, it appears that for whatever reason, they've decided just to cave in completely. And of course, they're saying, no, we haven't. We've made all these things. And now there's acceptance. This first time, the wonderful agreement between China and the Vatican and so on and so forth. Absolute nonsense. Go listen to Cardinal Zen. Cardinal Zen was, of course, the principal, as a Chinese bishop, as the Archbishop of Hong Kong, was the principal bishop involved in all of this. And he has been protesting for years already, begging the Holy Father, please, please, let's stop this. And in fact, what's really strange is let me see the agreement. He, Cardinal Zen, has not been allowed to see this so-called agreement that was signed. So, with
Yeah,
all of
the
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 claims
one
of
guy
all
who knows what's going
transparency.
on is kept out in the dark.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's because obviously things are horrific. And you can see it for the reality that it is, because look at the oppressions of the Chinese Catholics. They're not only just continuing sort of or lessening a little bit. Oh, no, no, no. They're exacerbated. Since the so-called signing of the Chinese Vatican Agreement, there have been further persecutions. Those who have come up out of the woodwork are now exposed and come up out of their underground hiding. They've been exposed because they've been encouraged to do that by the Pope himself.
Mm-hmm.
The Pope put out a video talking to the Chinese, telling them to get with the church, the patriotic church. What he said, in fact, was be good citizens. Today in church, I'll quote it for you. It says, today the church in China looks to the future with hope. said Pope Francis. He said the church wants Chinese Christians to be truly Christians and to be good citizens. They need to, he said, achieve the unity of the divided Catholic community. That is insanity. For one thing, in China, what the Chinese government means by being a good citizen is having it first and foremost be about the Chinese communist government rather than about God. They are in the place of God. That's why in the Chinese Catholic churches, they replace the crucifix with the red flag of China. It is by no means Catholic. They are, and we, as Cardinal Zen says, it's feeding them to the lions. They've fed them to the enemy, and they won't talk. They talk all this talk about dialogue, this and that, and this and that, and yet they're not dialoguing with Cardinal Zen, and they are dialoguing, as Cardinal Zen says, with the enemy. Yeah. He knows many of the bishops and priests who are under arrest, and some of whom have been killed. And so for him, these are very, very real and very horrific things that he's witnessing. His own people being handed over to the lions by none other than the Pope and Cardinal Parolin and those working with him in a situation which has left him just, I'm sure, wondering, but many times on his knees and praying, and I'm sure weeping over this situation.
I mean, the parallel stands out, and other people have made it with the Church of England. I mean, imagine if Henry VIII, and then, beyond him, Queen Elizabeth I, they're killing priests, they're banning, the Mass, all these things. And it would be like the Pope saying, well, I know all you underground Catholics have been trying to keep the flame alive, but just make do with the Church of England. Let the king or the queen appoint the bishops, right? I mean, how is this even possible in church history?
Somehow the Vatican has agreed to is allowing the legitimacy of 8 bishops from this so-called patriotic association, this Catholic, so-called Catholic church in China, government appointed.
Communist.
And they were communist government appointed. And not only that, they were excommunicated under Popes Benedict and JP2.
Great point.
And yet those same bishops are now recognized by the Vatican as legitimate bishops. It is impossible. And funny enough, too, the 3 bishops who were loyal to the Holy See, they actually stepped down to allow for that, to be replaced by those government-approved bishops. It's a situation that actually defies any kind of logic and understanding. It has left the faithful in China not only vulnerable, but in a time of persecution where they feel they've been abandoned by the hierarchy of the church itself. Thank God that they have Bishop or Cardinal Zen, who continues to stand for them and to fight for them and to be a public voice for them and to give them assurance of the one true faith. But when they see this coming from the Pope, from Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State in the Vatican, it makes for an impossible situation. They don't allow children to go to Mass.
Yeah.
Because they want to reserve it for when they're adults, they say, or whatever.
You indoctrinate them as communists, as children, and then when they're 18, do you want to start going to Mass? And they're like, no.
Yeah. And so the program is to wipe out the Catholic faith.
Are there people who are rejecting these new bishops, or are the Catholics just saying, well, Francis says, so we're doing it? What's the state, like the situation just in a town somewhere in China?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a bunch of people who have sort of latched on to what the Vatican's been saying and come out of basically the underground church. And they therefore are perhaps less concerned about massive persecution, but they also have to lose the faith. They have to succumb. They have to give in to the communist ideals of state first and communism first, God later. They have to go into churches where no longer do they see a crucifix, they see the red flag of China up there. They have to allow for their children not to go. They have no more funeral options either. And so there are those. There are also some who continue to resist, continue to hold true to the one true faith. You're talking about millions, tens of millions of Catholics who remain in underground churches despite all of this craziness, who are in dire need of our own prayers and whose sacrifices and sufferings are helping us probably more than we'll ever know, except in the afterlife.
Yeah.